Ladies and gents, welcome back. Today I have with me special guest, and this is the filmmaker of a series of documentaries here in Canada. And I'm just going to introduce him first before bringing him on. This is Aaron Gunn. He's put together some really amazing documentaries. I got in a little trouble even talking about his last documentary, but this new one I don't think will be seen by YouTube as such a bad thing to be talking about. But this is Fractured Nation, the Pillaging of Western Canada. And today I brought in Aaron Gunn himself. Aaron, thanks for joining me once again on the channel.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's good to be here and chat about these important issues.
Yeah, your last one, Canada is Dying, got age gated on YouTube. I got age gated just even talking about it. It seems like that issue is one that's sour for the tech giants. But this new documentary that you have out, of course, everyone go watch that one by all means. Fractured Nation, the Pillaging of Western Canada. I don't know how anyone can come out of this, especially if someone who's in Western Canada, not walking out of the theater or watching this on YouTube as a Western separatist. What was the goal of this? I mean, you were just trying to portray the story of where we are in Canada, but yeah, give us your thoughts on putting this film together.
Yeah, well, the goal of the documentary was to tell the story of Western alienation, the feeling that Western Canada is not getting a fair shake in Confederation right now, whether that be through equalization or some of the decisions from the Supreme Court or the so-called just transition. So we really wanted to dive into this issue. It was not meant to, going into the documentary, we kind of wanted to talk to both sides, the side that that thinks it's basically time for the West to separate, and the side that thinks, Confederation really needs to be renewed. And coming at it, it wasn't my intention for a lot of people to walk away with from the documentary and from that information with the new army of separatists. But it seems like that's kind of what happened. Maybe unintentionally, but just because really when you get into the facts, they are so outrageous that there is an injustice happening in this country, but I'm still somewhat hopeful we can turn things around.
Yeah, well, yeah, it would be hopeful to turn things around. We knew that Quebec years ago, when I was a little kid, wanted to separate and become their own thing, and there was actually a referendum. There was a serious thought towards that. Now, in the West, we have what's called the just transition, and can you explain a little bit about what that is for people who just don't know?
Yeah, the just transition, the so-called just transition that Trudeau talks about and the Liberal government talks about, is a plan to basically phase out Canada's oil and gas industry and replace said industry with so-called green jobs. So that's what the just transition is in a nutshell. It's a way of almost a euphemism for essentially killing Canada's and Western Canada specifically most important industry under the guise of some ideological crusade. So that's what the just transition is all about, and that of course plays a focal point in the documentary. Now, the oil and gas sector being so critical to Western Canada has played a story in Western alienation before. The National Energy Program back in the 1980s that Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, brought in, similarly caused a massive uproar, a huge economic devastation throughout Western Canada. But as Danielle Smith said during the documentary, Pierre Trudeau wanted to at least steal our resources and give them to Eastern Canada, and Justin Trudeau just wants to destroy it for everyone.
Well, this is the most interesting thing that I didn't know going into the documentary was the fact that some of the eastern provinces like Quebec and New Brunswick, a number of them, have their own resources. They have resources that are completely untapped. And it's actually this idea of equalization payments that are inhibiting them from even going into that. Can you explain like how is it that this is so backwards to anybody who sees this? How is it that an entire province won't tap into their natural resources because they won't get welfare payments from the Western Canada? How does that work?
Yeah, so this is one of the big shocking things that I found was so first of all, the provinces, maybe we got to take a step back to explain equalization.
Okay.
So equalization is the federal program. It's embedded within the Constitution, which basically says the federal government has to ensure that all provincial governments are financially capable of delivering a similar level of services to all Canadians, like healthcare. And so the federal government takes into account all these different economic indicators to calculate your financial capacity, and then takes a bunch of money from all the provinces and then redistributes that money to only some provinces. So, for example, Alberta and BC have basically never received equalization payments from the government, whereas Quebec and the maritime provinces have received tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars over the years in these transfer payments. Now, so that in itself is somewhat controversial, but I've honestly found that, especially in Western Canada, most people aren't really opposed to that concept, where it's, if we in the West have more resources and are generating more wealth, most people are actually quite happy to help fellow Canadians out in the East who might not be as well off or don't have these resources.
Sure.
Where it starts getting to be very frustrating and controversial is when I found out that many of these Eastern provinces, especially Quebec, but also provinces like New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, actually have their own vast natural resource reserves that they are choosing not to develop. And they're choosing not to develop those resources, possibly because of some kind of ideology, but B, because if they choose to develop those resources, they will lose their equalization payments. They're essentially the kind of their welfare transfer payments in Canada. And it was actually calculated by the Fraser Institute that for every dollar in new natural resource revenue that they bring in, they could lose up to 95 or 97 cents of equalization revenue. So basically, they actually make nothing out of developing their resources, and thus disincentivizes them from actually improving their economy.
Yeah, an absolute disincentive for that. Now, does it work the other way around? Can Alberta, for example, just one day everybody decides they're just going to sit on their thumbs and get no work done? Would Quebec and Ontario and New Brunswick end up having to pay Albertans?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if maybe one day if Justin Trudeau gets his way and kills the oil and gas industry, I guess Alberta might be the recipients of equalization payments in that hypothetical reality. But the big thing that's important to note too is that a couple of the people I interviewed from Quebec pointed out is that this kind of if you develop your resources, you lose all the equalization money. Creating a strong disincentive for governments to pursue these kind of projects that carry a certain amount of political risk to them. But that doesn't apply to Quebecers as a whole, or New Brunswickers as a whole, because while the government revenue might equalize, these provinces are losing out on all of the jobs, all of the income, all of the societal stability that comes with these projects. They're losing out on all of it. So really, at the end of the day, it's kind of, it's like the old welfare trap. It's the people that are actually in these provinces, like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Quebec, that are really actually suffering the most from these policies.
So the one thing that really shocked me the most, because I've heard about equalization, I've heard about just transition, because I'm in tune with all of these things. But the one thing I never heard about was the representation in the Supreme Court. I didn't realize that since Canada's establishment, the West has just not had as much representation in there. As far as most provinces have some judges, but it looks like Quebec has an unequal amount of judges as opposed to everybody else. How did that come to be, and why is that still that way today?
Well, the short answer would be, I think if you look at, let's say, the United States is a country that was founded as a certain degree of ideological purity. A revolutionary state where they laid down rules. Some people disagree with the rules. Some people support them. Like every state has 2 senators, and then representation by population for the Congress. And so in Canada, it was basically it's like a compromise country. People basically, the country was formed by horse trading politicians trying to entice various provinces into confederation at different times. And so you basically have a hangover from this. in the sense that if you go back to 1867, when the country was created, and in the decades immediately after, a lot of these deals were made to grant certain jurisdictions either a certain amount of Supreme Court seats, a certain amount of Senate seats, or a certain percentage of the House of Commons. And that still exists to this day. I think the problem becomes is the West in Canada was very uninhabited, obviously during this period of time during the 1800s, and now has grown into the fastest growing and most economically productive region of the country with its own distinct culture in many ways. And that is not represented in the framework of the country, and it's certainly not represented in the elites that govern the country, who all too often kind of reside in that Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal corridor.
Yeah, so it's so hard to imagine the people who hold the power, especially in a geographical region like Eastern Canada, to just relinquish this kind of power, to just go, okay, Western Canada, here you go, here's equal representation, and then we'll obviously it would probably move in a direction in the favor of the Western provinces at that. Is there any hope that we will get some sort of equal representation across the board to a more modern Canada, or is separation, the breakup of Canada, sort of the inevitability here?
Well, I think it's an inevitability if we don't change course. If Trudeau continues to antagonize different regions, I think Canada, it's a federation. It's a massive country. It's a country where the vast majority of the population spread out on this narrow strip across the border. There's a massive geographic distance between Victoria and St. John's, Newfoundland. Uh, but I think there is a commonality there where people can come together in the Canadian tradition if we have real political leadership and help renew and reform Confederation for the better. I will say I do find Quebec to be a persistent challenge because they're a bit in a bubble compared to anybody else. I don't think they have a lot of antagonism for the rest of Canada, but it's more indifference. And that becomes very difficult where you have one province that holds a disproportionate amount of weight within Confederation that's kind of just doing its own thing and doesn't really care about anybody else. And that's the situation we find ourselves in. In New Brunswick, for example, I sat down with the Premier of New Brunswick, and he was very sympathetic to the plight of the West and talked about how, in his opinion, New Brunswick shouldn't receive equalization payments if it wasn't developing the same resources that the provinces who were sending him the money were developing. So, in Atlantic Canada, I actually found a lot of people were receptive to this message. In Quebec, it's a bit more of an uphill climb.
Yeah, I suppose the film is Fractured Nation: The Pillaging of Western Canada. Thank you so much today, Aaron Gunn, for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.